You're so excited because you found your ancestor in the record, right? But wait, are you sure you really found the right person? Hey there, if we haven't met before, I am Lisa with Are You My Cousin? And this YouTube channel is designed to help you find your ancestor, grow that family tree, but not be overwhelmed in the process. So if that sounds like your cup of tea, you're in the right place. Verifying information that we find on our ancestors is a crucial part of our genealogy research. Because after all, we don't want to do all that research only to realize that we found the wrong person and have to chop off part of that family tree. Nobody likes to do that, I can assure you. So it's important that we make sure that every time we find that ancestor in the record, we verify that and we make sure we've got that right person before we keep moving our research forward. So I'm going to be sharing with you ways that you can verify that you have the right ancestor and that you're now ready to move your research to that next generation back. So let's talk about the source for your information for your ancestor, because this is something that we absolutely need to pay a lot of attention to. We want to identify the source of where that information for our ancestor came from, and we want to consider the author's expertise. So when you think about that source, is it a primary source? Okay, like a birth certificate, often those were created at the time of the event. So we want to consider that. We want to consider the author, the person who created the document. What was their expertise? Did they actually even have authority to really give good information on that? So for instance, with that birth certificate, was it the midwife who attended that birth and who delivered that child who created that document? Well, then that information is pretty accurate, I would say. But say when we look at death certificates and we look at things such as names of parents, when somebody was born, that type of information, where they were born, well, that usually is taken information that is provided by a person who may or may not have known that individual very well. And so the information could be a little suspect or maybe not as accurate. So we want to keep that in mind of what that source is, but who was providing that information for that particular record. We want to also look at the date that the record was created as well as the context in which it was created. So was that record that you have found evidence for your ancestor, was it created at the time of the event, or was it created days, months, or even years after that event? Because that can certainly lead to discrepancies if it was created a long time after the actual event did occur. So we want to make sure that we are paying attention to that as well. And then we also want to assess the actual evidence that is in that record. Is it supporting the claim that you are making? Are you saying that Jane Smith is the wife of John? Well, look at that census record. Does it state that John is the head of the household and that Jane is his wife? Well, that supports your claim, right? But what if it's one of the census years where they just list the household individuals out, but they don't necessarily put the actual relationship in there? So we may make that assumption and infer that Jane is the wife of John because we have, John is a certain age, Jane would be close to his age, and all the others are obviously young children. So that's more of, we can infer that, but we can't say 100% for sure. So we want to make sure that we understand what that evidence is actually being presented and how we can interpret it correctly in the record. Now, once you've really looked and evaluated the source of that, you want to cross-reference what you're finding. Because if you're not sure if you forgot the right ancestor and you're feeling like, is it really, is it not? Go ahead and start cross-referencing with multiple sources. So look at the record that you have, but then seek out other records that could support the evidence that you have, or it may disprove and say, no, you don't have the right person. So don't rely on just a single source of information. Go ahead and see if you can find other supporting evidence out there for it as well. You also want to look for inconsistencies across the records. Now, be mindful of this, because every researcher out there, whether you're a beginning, whether you're intermediate, whether you've been researching for years, we seek inconsistencies when it comes to the records. And just make sure you understand, sometimes we have to get into and research that a little bit more to understand, why did that inconsistency show up? Is it because poor handwriting and mistranscript, or things that were transcribed incorrectly so that it just kind of perpetuated through the records? Or maybe somebody our ancestors were not always truthful. In some time periods and in some cultures, it was actually ancestors would actually say they were older than they were because the elderly were revered. So they would have maybe fudged their age up a little bit. Maybe for women, maybe they're kind of saying, no, I'm not really 30 yet. I'm only 28. So you want to think about who would have been taking that information, who was providing it, and how that would have been. So look for those inconsistencies and consider why you're seeing those inconsistencies. And again, you want to consider the type of record, as we kind of mentioned before. Is it one that is a primary source of information, like a birth certificate, or is it one that is a little bit more of a family story type of information? Maybe it came from somebody's diary. Okay, so that's a little bit different than saying having a primary source versus having something that's a little more not suspect, but has a little more opportunity for variability in it, such as an oral history or a story, a letter, that kind of thing. And then once you've done that, once you've really looked at that source, you've cross-referenced with other sources, I really want you to sit down and really think about we just need to think. We need to use our critical thinking skills. And the first thing we want to do when it comes to that is we want to ask questions. Don't just blindly accept that record, that information that you've got at face value. Question everything. Always ask why and seek out those logical explanations. So ask questions about it. Use what I like to call your genealogy gut. Once I've done all the others, I've looked at the sources, I've cross-referenced, does it feel right? And I know that's really kind of, ambiguous, but does it feel right? And if I keep asking questions, am I going to find that answer? So you think through what's happening there. And if it's really something else we need to go for, consider things like when you're asking questions, consider historical plausibility. Understand what was happening in history. What was the norm? So if something isn't quite right because you're like, I'm not really sure they actually did that, or that was the custom of the day for handling baptisms within the community where your ancestor was, or handling death and death rituals and funerals. Maybe it just wasn't the norm. And so that means something. So think about that and stop and evaluate that as well. So to consider what's happening. And certainly just be aware of common errors, guys. We see this frequently. We are going to come across errors. I don't know a genealogy researcher who hasn't. And again, it could be everything from just a name variation, a mistranscribed letter. Sometimes our ancestors went by nicknames. Sometimes they went by their full names. Just be vigilant about that so it doesn't trip you up. I think when we are just watchful and aware, we can catch those early on. We can clarify what's really happening in that record. Yes, this really is the person, even though they're using initials as opposed to the name. Then we can, as long as we're aware of that, we can make sure that we are moving forward correctly. And then lastly, sometimes what we really need to do is we'll need to seek out an expert for advice. So when it comes to, if you're really still not sure, seek out that expert. It could be a professional genealogist. There are so many wonderful researchers out there who are doing this professionally. They can help you out. They can sometimes give you a different perspective on your research. They may be able to have access to records that you are struggling to get. So I would encourage you to seek them out. Other options that you have would be to join a genealogy society or an online forum and ask questions there, because I find folks in genealogy societies incredibly helpful, incredibly generous with their knowledge, and incredibly good researchers. It's very helpful sometimes, I think, because we can be so close to our research and so invested in it that when we can have a third party kind of come in and look at it and evaluate it for us, they can sometimes see things that we struggle to see because we've been in the middle of it for so long. So getting that person to come in and say, hey, could you evaluate this evidence? Do they come up with the same conclusion you do? Or do they have a new perspective? Or maybe they might come back and say, hey, did you think to look at this record set? And again, just what you can offer to do the same thing. So just kind of have a buddy system there. It's a great way. It's a great exercise for your research skills, as well as to help both of you out. And then lastly, what I would encourage you to do is attend workshops and webinars. So when you're not really sure and struggling, continue to educate yourself. There's so many wonderful options, free and paid, out there that you could take advantage of. And many of them, certainly since the pandemic, can be done virtually at home. So there's really no reason not to continually to continually educate yourself along the way. Okay, I hope you found that helpful, guys. Nobody wants to do all that research only to realize you made a mistake early on and we have to lop off that side of the family tree. Not the kind of pruning that any of us likes to do, I can assure you. So I hope you found those strategies helpful. If you'd like to learn more about finding your ancestors, making sure we've got the right people on that family tree, be sure and watch that video on the screen now.